The first sound is the wind, finding a fractured clay tile in a roof that once kept imperial rain off painted plaster. It is a slow, methodical draft. It hums through the narrow gap where Roman mortar has finally dried and turned to powdery ash. Down below, in the ruins of a courtyard that once echoed with the sandals of magistrates, frost settles onto a mosaic floor. It traces the edges of a geometric pattern in rhymed white, biting into the cold stone. A footstep sounds against the path, a heavy boot crushing the dry, hollow weeds that have begun to claim the crown of the road. There is no courier arriving with a stamped wax seal from a distant capital. There is no ledger being tallied. There is only the frost, the stone, and the quiet. They will call these centuries the Dark Ages. They will speak of them as an abyss, an empty void on the timeline where the light of a vast civilization flickered out, leaving the island to be swallowed by shadows. But the dark was not an emptiness, it was an absence of ink. The paper goes first, the people stay. The darkness is simply the name we give to the profound silence of the archive. Life did not end when the imperial administration withdrew its legions and its clerks. It merely retreated. It pulled back into smaller rooms, into tighter communities, and into longer nights. It became a world that no longer kept a meticulous written record of its own survival, an order that left almost no paper trail, leaving later generations to mistake a quiet house for a vacant one. Where the historical record runs thin, we look for anchors. We hear the echoes of a fractured world through the fierce, thunderous voice of a British cleric remembered as Gildas. In a small, bitter book called De Excidio e Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, he sets down the catastrophe of his age. He does not write as a detached observer holding a census. He writes as a moralist, crying out that the old order had failed the island, speaking of abandoned towns, of civil rot, and of small kings who build their halls upon the wreckage. Alongside his fading ink, archaeology speaks its own slow truth. It shows us the villa courtyards where grand ornamental pools were filled in with earth to make way for timber workshops. It shows us the heavy stone mile markers standing beside roads that gradually forgot the weight of imperial messengers.
Yet, beneath the cleric's cry, and beneath the slow crumbling of the state, ordinary night kept happening. The rain still fell on the chalk hills. Cattle still breathed heavy steam into the freezing morning air, their low bells ringing softly at the edge of the dark. Iron still rang out against the anvil, shaping tools for a soil that still demanded turning. Children still walked the boundaries of their father's fields in the fading light, learning the landscape by heart, because there was no longer a registry in a walled city to keep their name. What was it like to inhabit that long, uncharted twilight? What filled the silence when the machinery of an empire stopped moving? The dread of this age was not a cinematic avalanche of fire and sword. It was the slow, creeping realization of an administrative dusk, the fading of a system that leaves a people to face the deep winter entirely alone. Tonight, we do not chase every nameless warband across a muddy map. We will not dwell on the clash of shields or the violence that distant legends exaggerate. We stay with the long dusk. We linger in the cold hypocausts slowly filling with soil, on the thinner roads winding between silent farmsteads, and beside the monastic lamps that still tried to keep the old names alive in a changing world. We walk into the twilight of post-Roman Britain, not to watch the end of the world, but to witness how ordinary life goes on when the lights of a vast administration finally dim. It is a profound shift when the mechanism of an entire era powers down. It does not happen with a sudden shattering of the sky, nor with a single dramatic closing of a great door. It happens with a slow, creeping quiet that settles into the floorboards and the paving stones, a gradual dimming of the administrative lamps. Welcome, Sleepyheads, to another journey into the quiet, forgotten corners of the past. I am so glad you have found your way here tonight. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock currently reads in your part of the world, I want you to know that you can leave the relentless demands of your own day at the threshold. There is no urgency here, no modern rush, no ledgers to balance, and no deadlines to meet. There is only the long, slow breath of history, moving at the gentle pace of a dying ember on a hearth. Take a moment to adjust your surroundings. Sink deeper into whatever is holding you. Let the tension drop from your shoulders. Let the heavy, rigid armor of waking life fall away. We are traveling back into a landscape defined by its twilight, and twilight requires no effort to witness. If you find that this quiet corner of the archive brings you a sense of peace, and if you wish to help us keep these nocturnal fires burning, leaving a simple like on this video is a gentle, silent way to support the channel. It tells the algorithm that there is still a place for history spoken softly, without the frantic shouting and the harsh cuts of the modern world. That is the only thing we will ever ask of you. The rest of this time, the rest of this long and peaceful night is entirely yours to rest, to listen, or to sleep. Tonight, we are looking closely at a time that has been deeply misunderstood by the centuries that followed. For generations, people have looked back at post-Roman Britain and seen only a black void, a time of utter collapse, of continuous violent struggle and universal savagery. But the truth of this era is far more complicated and, in its own melancholy way, far more beautiful. They called it dark because the paper went quiet, not because the island emptied. The grand civilization that Rome built across the hills and valleys of Britain was fundamentally an infrastructure of light, of paved highways, of complex taxation, of marble inscribed with crisp Latin letters, and above all, of writing. When that vast administrative machine finally withdrew its legions and its clerks, the dread that followed was not a single catastrophic avalanche that wiped away all humanity. It was an ordinary, quiet dread. It was the slow realization that the state was no longer watching, no longer recording, no longer fixing the stone bridges or delivering the mail. The central pillar of our journey tonight is a simple truth. The paper goes first. The people stay. The darkness was an environment, a localizing of daily life, an era where survival meant tending your own hearth rather than looking to a distant emperor across the sea. In this long dusk of the island, you belong to the quiet fields and the thinner road. Over the next few hours, we are going to walk through this changing landscape together. We will let the centuries pass slowly, observing the rich texture of the dusk. Our journey will begin on the cracking stones of a Roman road that has finally lost its courier, tracing the very edge of a system that no longer answers the calls of its citizens. From there, we will listen to the fierce, solitary thunder of Gildas, a man standing in the ruins of a Roman mindset, trying to make sense of the rot. We will look beyond his moral despair to find the people the paper forgot, examining the silent archaeology of farmsteads and families who carried on planting and harvesting, proving that the land was never abandoned.
As the night deepens, we will wander through the remnants of the ancient towns, feeling the chill of a world when the grand public baths went cold and the exquisite mosaics were slowly covered by the softening earth. We will experience a true night without the empire, settling into the rhythms of village life, where darkness was a physical environment and the natural order of work and rest was governed entirely by the sun and the stars, devoid of any urban glow. Our path will then take us out of the old towns and into the warmth of the newly raised timber halls, sitting among small kings who gathered their loyalty not with coins and written laws, but with gifts, oaths, and the shared light of the fire. We will walk the hazy, shifting borders at the edge of two worlds, witnessing the slow meeting of the native Brittonic peoples and the incoming Germanic settlers, a meeting defined less by cinematic massacres and more by a quiet, complex blending of languages, burials, and farmscapes over generations. As the centuries push forward, we will find sanctuary in the small stone rooms where the lamps kept the old names alive, observing the monks and nuns who scratched thin lines of ink across vellum, keeping a fragile bridge of literacy open in the deep night. We will witness three small specific mercies that prove humanity endures even when the state collapses, finding the quiet lights that shine brightest in the long dusk. And finally, we will look back with the scholars of later ages to see exactly how and why they gave this silence the name of the Dark Ages. This film is designed to run for roughly 2.5 hours. It is an anthology of slow moments, a continuous, unbroken landscape of sound and story. There is no test at the end, and no sudden alarms to startle you. You are completely free to drift off whenever sleep finally comes for you. If you fall asleep in the 3rd chapter, you can return tomorrow night and pick up in the 4th. The island will wait for you. The ruins will not rush away. So, let your eyes close. Let the modern world, with all its blinding screens and instant demands, fade completely out of view. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the wind moving over the broken roof tiles. We are stepping out onto a stone highway. The pavement is still straight, still meticulously engineered to outlast empires. But the courier is late. The silence is settling in. Beside a long, unwavering stretch of the Fosse Way, half buried in the damp earth of a chill morning, stands a cylindrical pillar of local stone. It is a Roman milestone, heavy and resolute, planted firmly in the soil centuries ago to mark the distance to the next administrative center. If you were to trace your fingers over its rough, weathered surface, you would feel the shallow grooves of Latin letters carved into the rock. They spell out the name of an emperor who ruled from a city thousands of miles away, a man whose profile was stamped on coins and whose authority was absolute. But the rain has softened the edges of his name. Green moss and pale gray lichen have crept into the carved grooves, blurring the imperial decree into the natural texture of the landscape. The stone remains, but the system that placed it here, the vast network of command and calculation, has slowly gone quiet. What happens to a highway engineered for an empire when the empire no longer has any messages to send? To understand the long dusk of post-Roman Britain, we must begin on the pavement. The Roman road was not simply a path worn down by passing feet. It was a deliberate, muscular imposition of order upon the island. It was built with deep foundations of heavy, unworked stone, layered with sand and rammed chalk, and topped with tightly packed gravel or paving stones, all steeply cambered so that the endless British rain would run off into carefully dug drainage ditches on either side. These roads cut through dense forests, spanned wide rivers, and crested the high chalk ridges with an arrogant, unyielding straightness. They were the arteries of civilization, designed to move legions at a terrifying speed, to transport the heavy lead and silver extracted from the hills, and, perhaps most importantly, to carry the mail. For nearly 4 centuries, the cursus publicus, the imperial post, was the rhythm of the road. A network of couriers rode in relays, their pouches heavy with official correspondence, tax assessments, military orders, and the endless bureaucratic paperwork of a sprawling state. They rode on the authority of the emperor, exchanging exhausted horses for fresh ones at the mansiones, the official way stations, spaced at regular intervals along the routes. The sound of the empire was the heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves on packed gravel, the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels, and the sharp voices of officials flashing wax-sealed documents at toll gates. But as the 5th century opened, that rhythm began to falter. The crisis did not announce itself with a sudden, apocalyptic wall of fire sweeping down the highway. It announced itself through absence. The couriers simply became less frequent. The heavy wagons carrying new shipments of freshly minted bronze coins from the continent stopped arriving. The garrisons on the northern frontiers, waiting for the silver that paid for their loyalty and their bread, found themselves staring down an empty road. The vast, interconnected machine of the state was running out of fuel. When the Emperor Honorius reportedly sent a letter to the cities of Britain around the year 410, telling them to look to their own defenses, it was merely the formal acknowledgement of a reality that the people living along the roads had already sensed. The great engine of Rome had stopped turning.
Imagine a local magistrate, a decurion of a provincial British town, standing at the edge of the road, waiting for instructions that will never come. He is a man who has ordered his entire life around the written law, around the schedules of taxation and the civic duties required of his class. He wears the outward trappings of a Roman citizen, yet he looks down a highway that stretches toward a sea he can no longer safely cross, toward a capital that can no longer send an army to protect him. The silence of the road is not just the absence of noise, it is the terrifying silence of a severed connection. The infrastructure of light, the paper, the coins, the laws, is dimming. He is left standing in a large, unheated house, realizing that authority is no longer something granted from afar, but something he must forge himself, locally, in the gathering dusk. Down the road, a mansio sits quietly, slowly surrendering to the elements. Once a bustling courtyard of stables, storehouses, and warm guest rooms for traveling officials, it is now returning to the earth. The timber doors have been stripped away, repurposed by nearby farmers to shore up their own barns. The central courtyard, once swept clean by servants, is now choked with thistle and tough, wiry grass. In the ruined bathhouse attached to the station, there is only the sound of the wind in a broken roof tile, a low, hollow whistle that hums through the cracked clay. The empire is not being violently destroyed here. It is simply being dismantled, piece by piece, out of necessity. And yet, this is where the grand illusion of the Dark Ages begins to fracture. The history books, written long after, would look at the empty way stations and the fading milestones and declare that the island had plunged into a void.
They saw the end of the imperial administration and assumed it meant the end of all things. But the paper goes first. The people stay. The farmers who lived in the valleys below the Fosse Way did not evaporate simply because the tax assessors stopped knocking on their doors. They still awoke before dawn. The damp wool of their cloaks still smelled of wood smoke and morning mist. They still drove their oxen into the heavy clay soils, leaning their weight into iron-tipped plows to turn the earth for the winter wheat. The survival of the island did not depend on the parchment of the imperial post. It depended on the harvest, on the careful preservation of grain, and on the quiet, enduring rhythms of agricultural life. Stone, lichen, and wind. The great affairs of state had retreated, but the ordinary matters of survival remained exactly as they had always been. In fact, for many, the silence of the road might have felt like a strange kind of relief. For generations, the highway had been an instrument of extraction. It was the route by which their surplus grain was carted away to feed distant armies, the path by which the tax collectors arrived to demand their share in hard currency. When the coins stopped flowing and the administration withered, the heavy, demanding hand of the state was lifted. The road changed from a conduit of the empire into a local utility. The people who now walked its cracked paving stones were not imperial messengers, but local men and women driving a handful of sheep to a neighboring settlement, or carrying a basket of woven cloth to trade for salt and iron. As the decades slipped by, the very meaning of the road began to shift in the minds of the people who lived beside it. It was no longer a tether connecting them to Rome or even to London. It became a geographical boundary, a massive, ancient ridge in the landscape that divided one local territory from another. The deep ditches on either side, once meant for drainage, became defensive markers. The straight lines of the pavement, cutting unnaturally through the curves of the hills, began to seem like the work of giants from a forgotten age, rather than the engineering of grandfathers. Distance itself began to change. When the empire was functioning, a man in a British town could hold a letter and know it would reach the Mediterranean in a matter of weeks, carried along a frictionless surface of administrative order. The world was small, bound together by the certainty of the road. But in the long dusk, distance expanded. Without the couriers, without the cleared forests and the maintained bridges, the next valley over suddenly felt incredibly far away. A journey of 30 miles was no longer a routine day trip for a magistrate. It was a hazardous expedition into the unknown, across a landscape where the rules were no longer written down. The world was shrinking back to the horizon. This is the chilling reality of the post-Roman world. It is the profound isolation of standing on a magnificent piece of engineering and realizing that it leads nowhere anymore. The physical structure of civilization remains under your feet, the carefully laid gravel, the monumental stone bridges, the straight lines slicing through the woods, but the animating spirit of that civilization has evaporated. You are left with the skeleton of a giant, a monumental ruin that you cannot rebuild and do not fully understand, but which you must somehow navigate every day of your life. The Fosse Way, Watling Street, Ermine Street, these great arteries did not vanish overnight. They slowly dissolved into the landscape, worn away by the rain, overgrown by the encroaching forests, their stones prized up one by one to build small local walls around small local lives. The darkness that settled over them was the darkness of an environment returning to its natural scale. The lights of the distant cities had gone out, leaving the island illuminated only by the faint, scattered glow of 1,000 isolated hearths. The road had lost its courier, and in the profound, heavy quiet that followed, The people of the island turned away from the fading milestones and looked inward, into the deepening dusk. In a cold, dimly lit room, a man sits leaning over a rough-hewn wooden desk. The light comes from a single, sputtering oil lamp, its small flame casting long, shivering shadows against a wall of undressed stone. It is the 6th century, and the vast humming machinery of the Roman world that once regulated this island is a fading memory, slipping quietly into the soil. But in this room, a different kind of machinery is at work. It is the slow, deliberate scratch of a quill on scraped animal skin. The man holds a knife in one hand to sharpen the feather and erase his mistakes, and a pen in the other, dipping it into a small horn filled with dark iron gall ink. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth, cold ash, and the faint bitter tang of the oak galls used to make the black liquid. This man is a British cleric. History will remember him simply as Gildas. In the long dusk of post-Roman Britain, where the written record has thinned to an almost impenetrable silence, his voice is one of the very few that still reaches us. He is not writing a ledger. He is not recording a census, nor is he drafting the kind of imperial correspondence that traveled the paved highways of his grandfathers. He is writing a fiercely passionate, blistering sermon of moral thunder. He calls it De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. To understand the dark, we must understand the few lights that were left burning to describe it, and Gildas is a blazing, angry fire in a long night. We moderns often come to his text hungry for facts. We want a journalist. We want a calm, objective historian to give us exact dates, troop movements, and the precise borders of the kingdoms that fractured in the wake of Rome's withdrawal. But Gildas has no interest in satisfying the curiosity of 21st century archaeologists. He is a man of the church, an Old Testament prophet standing in the ruins of a Roman province, and he is looking at his world through a lens of profound moral despair. He writes to save souls, to chastise kings, and to make sense of a tragedy that he believes was brought upon his people by their own spectacular sins. When we read his dense, swirling Latin, we are reading a cry of grief. Gildas looks out at his Britain and sees a landscape of rot. He writes of cities that were once bustling centers of civic order, now lying desolate, their walls broken, their altars dismantled. He describes a world where the old laws have failed, replaced by the cruel, arbitrary whims of warlords. He names the men who rule the island in his time, addressing them directly with biting, furious insults. He calls out Constantine, the tyrannical whelp of the unclean lioness of Damnonia. He points a trembling, ink-stained finger at Aurelius Conanus, at Vortipor, at Cuneglassus, and at Maelgwan, the dragon of the island. These are not the men of marble statues and senatorial decrees. These are the small kings of a fragmented age. They are men who rule from timber halls raised inside the crumbling earthworks of ancient hill forts, men who settle their disputes with iron and blood rather than written petitions. Gildas accuses them of civil war, of perjury, of murdering their rivals at the very altars of the churches, and of abandoning the Christian virtues that he believes were the true armor of the island. He frames the arrival of the Saxons, the Germanic groups crossing the North Sea, not merely as a migration or a geopolitical shift, but as a divine punishment, a fire sent by God to scour a wicked people, just as the Babylonians were sent to punish the Israelites. Because Gildas is the only major voice to survive from this specific stretch of centuries, his fierce sermon accidentally became our history. Later writers, separated from the reality of his time, would pick up De Excidio and take his biblical metaphors of fire, blood, and universal destruction as literal, unvarnished reportage. They read his lament for the crumbling civic architecture and assumed the entire island was a smoldering ash heap, entirely bereft of life. They allowed his brilliant, traumatic rhetoric to shape the memory of an entire era, giving birth to the myth of an apocalyptic dark age where civilizations simply snapped in half overnight. But we must tread carefully when we walk with Gildas. His view is incredibly sharp, but it is incredibly narrow. He is mourning the loss of the administrative state, the loss of Latin learning, and the decay of an elite urban culture that he felt he belonged to. When he walks through an abandoned Roman town, he does not see the opportunistic farmers who have simply moved out of the heavy stone buildings to build warmer, more efficient wooden homes nearby. He sees only the tragedy of the empty masonry. He hears the wind in a broken roof tile whistling through the cracked terracotta of a collapsed basilica, and he interprets it as the weeping of the earth itself. Yet, paradoxically, the very existence of Gildas proves that the dark was not absolute. He is sitting in a room, writing complex, highly educated Latin rhetoric. He has access to the scriptures, to the works of Virgil, to a network of fellow clerics who will read, copy, and distribute his manuscript. The very tools on his desk, the vellum, the specialized ink, the knife, require a surviving network of agriculture, trade, and craft. The paper goes first, the people stay. The civic administration that maintained the roads and the taxes may have evaporated, but the people who tanned the hides, who harvested the oak galls, and who maintained the quiet, enduring rhythms of the faith did not vanish. Gildas is the living proof that the island did not sink into an illiterate void. He is the paper that remained.
But what of the people he does not mention? What of the farmers who never saw a Roman bathhouse and whose lives were largely unchanged by the collapse of the imperial post? For them, the rhetoric of Gildas would have sounded alien. They were not worried about the moral failings of kings named Malguin. They were worried about the frost on the winter wheat, the damp in the sheep's wool, the amount of firewood stacked against the coming snow. Gildas ignores them because they are not the architects of the ruin he mourns. He is obsessed with the commanders, the kings, and the bishops, the men who had the power to uphold the light of the old order, and who, in his eyes, deliberately snuffed it out. Imagine him pausing in his work. He sets the quill down. He rubs his eyes, exhausted by the flickering light of the lamp and the immense weight of the grief he is trying to put into words. The room is freezing. The silence outside his door is absolute, unbroken by the sound of a city watchman or the rumble of a merchant's cart. He is surrounded by the ghosts of a system he still believes in, a Roman and Christian ideal of justice and order that is slowly being swallowed by a much older, much darker, and much more local way of living. He picks up the quill again, dips it into the black ink, and continues to write his island into the memory of the world. He did not know that his fierce little book would become a solitary bridge across centuries of silence. He did not know that the scholars of a distant, unimaginable future would peer through his words, trying to map the geography of a lost Britain, sifting through his insults and his tears to find the hard stone of historical fact. He was simply a man trying to make sense of the quiet, the decay, and the long twilight that had settled over his home. He wrote of ruin, and in doing so, he preserved the only surviving architecture of his age, the architecture of his own despair.
we look at his manuscript and see a fascinating artifact of a shifting world, a vital piece of the puzzle that helps us map the retreat of an empire. We study his vocabulary, we debate his dates, and we extract his words from their theological context to serve our own historical curiosity. From today's view, it's a priceless anchor in the quietest century of the archive. From their view, it was the bitter, desperate weeping of a world that felt completely abandoned by the light. And that's what's so chilling.
Beneath the frost-hardened surface of a west hill in the island, the earth holds a memory far older and far quieter than ink. It is an archive written not in Latin verbs or ecclesiastical decrees, but in layers of dark loam, crushed charcoal, and the microscopic golden dust of ancient pollen. To the naked eye, it is just a muddy trench dug into a hillside, but to the patient observer, the soil reveals the greatest optical illusion of the long dusk. When we read the thunderous despair of Gildas, or when we look at the empty milestones of the imperial highways, it is incredibly easy to believe the myth of the empty island. It is easy to picture a desolate wasteland where the forests came rushing back to swallow the farms, where the population evaporated into thin air or fell entirely to the swords of invading warbands. But the earth tells a very different, far more resilient story. The archaeology of the 5th and 6th centuries is not an archaeology of silence, it is simply an archaeology of subtlety. It is the story of the people the paper forgot. For hundreds of years, the inhabitants of this island had lived within a highly visible, highly durable material culture. The empire mass-produced its existence. If you lived in the 3rd century, your kitchen likely held bright red-gloss Samian-ware pottery shipped by the thousands from immense kilns in Gaul. You paid your taxes with standardized bronze and silver coins stamped with the profiles of distant rulers. You built foundations with heavy, mortared stone and roofed your homes with baked terracotta tiles. This was an infrastructure that left a loud, heavy footprint in the archaeological record. It was a civilization designed to be seen by the future. When the administrative state withered, that mass-produced visibility vanished. The industrial kilns across the sea stopped firing. The shipments of bright red bowls ceased. The mints stopped striking new coins, and the immense quarrying operations that pulled heavy stone from the earth ground to a halt. To a historian looking only for factory stamps and coinage, this sudden absence looks exactly like the end of the world. Because the ledger vanished, they assumed the grain vanished too. But the paper goes first. The people stay. The farmers did not suddenly forget how to eat because they lacked a mass-produced bowl imported from Gaul. They simply went down to the local riverbank, dug up the dense gray clay, and shaped their own rough, uneven vessels by hand, firing them in small clamp kilns at the edge of the woods. These pots were not elegant. They carried no maker's mark. They easily cracked and crumbled back into the mud from which they were formed, leaving very little trace for future centuries. The people did not stop trading. They merely stopped using the emperor's currency. A sack of grain was traded for a woven woolen cloak. A day of labor was exchanged for a newly forged iron knife. The economy did not cease to exist. It simply stepped out of the imperial light and returned to the quiet, unrecorded bartering of neighbors. If we want absolute proof that the island did not empty, we need only look at the bottom of the ancient lakes and peat bogs. Here, undisturbed by the plow, mud has accumulated year after year, trapping the microscopic pollen grains blown in on the wind. If the dark had truly been an apocalypse of abandonment, if the native Britons had all been slaughtered or fled to the sea,
The pollen record would show a massive, sudden explosion of wild tree pollen as the forests reclaimed the untended fields. But the mud does not show a wilderness returning. Layer after layer, through the 5th century, through the 6th century, the pollen of cereal crops, of barley, oats, and winter wheat, continues to fall. The weeds that thrive and turned arable soil continue to leave their invisible signature in the peat. The harvest never stopped. Generation after generation, families continued to wake before the dawn. They continued to hitch their oxen to the heavy plow, turning the stubborn clay of the valleys. They continued to scythe the hay in the summer heat and thresh the grain in the autumn wind. They did this without the protection of a Roman garrison, without the demands of a tax assessor, and entirely without the notice of history. Imagine a late winter evening on one of these unrecorded farmsteads. The grand stone villa in the next valley over has been abandoned to the damp, its mosaic floors slowly disappearing under a layer of blown dust and collapsing plaster. But here, life is warm, immediate, and painfully local. The family lives in a large, bow-sided timber hall, its massive wooden posts sunk deep into the earth. The walls are wattle, tightly woven hazel branches, smeared with thick, insulating dog made of mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof is a thick, heavy blanket of thatched reeds that traps the heat inside. At the center of the hall, a wide hearth fire burns low, casting a soft, golden glow over the faces of the people gathered around it. There are no oil lamps burning imported olive oil. The only light comes from the wood embers and perhaps a rushlight, a dried reed dipped in animal fat, burning dimly with a sputtering, smoky flame. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasted barley, and the wet wool of cloaks drying by the fire. At the far end of the hall, separated only by a low hurdle, the family's cattle are tethered for the winter. The slow, rhythmic sound of the animals chewing their cud, the heavy warmth of their bodies, fills the space. This is a life stripped down to its absolute essentials: warmth, food, and kin. Somewhere on the ridge above the farmstead, the wind hums through a broken roof tile in the ruins of an old estate wall. It is a hollow, lonely sound, a faint whistling reminder of the ghosts that built with stone. But down here in the timber house, the sound is ignored. The people gathered around the fire are not mourning the loss of the Roman post. They are mending a tear in a leather shoe. They are grinding grain on a heavy stone quern. They are whispering softly to a child who is falling asleep against their mother's knee. They are intensely, profoundly alive.
When these people died, they were not placed under carved marble headstones with crisp Latin inscriptions declaring their civic titles and the exact length of their lives. They were carried out to the edge of the settlement and laid in the earth. Sometimes they were buried with a simple iron knife at their hip, or a string of glass beads, or a small clay pot meant to hold a final drink. Often they were buried with nothing at all, wrapped only in a woolen shroud that would quickly dissolve into the soil. They left no names for the archive to memorize. They left only the faint dark stains of their timber post holes in the subsoil and the microscopic pollen of the crops they stubbornly coaxed from the earth. We look back at them from the vantage point of a hyper-recorded age, where every birth, every transaction, and every death is documented, filed, and stored. We are uncomfortable with the anonymity of the long dusk. We equate a lack of written history with a lack of humanity, assuming that because we do not know their names, their lives must have been a miserable, terrified scramble in the dark. We mistake our own blindness for their absence. But the silence of the archive is not the silence of the grave. It is simply the silence of a world that shrank back to the horizon,
a world that cared only for the health of the soil, the changing of the seasons, and the safety of the hearth. The grand narrative of empires rising and falling passed high over their heads like a storm blowing out to sea, leaving them to tend to the quiet, continuous work of living. From today's view, it's a terrifying demographic blank spot, an era where the human story seems to fall off a cliff into the dark. From their view, it was simply the rhythm of the harvest, continuing on exactly as it always had, but without the heavy, demanding shadow of an empire standing over the fields. And that's what's so chilling.
Place your bare hand against a floor of tightly packed stone in the middle of a British winter. Feel the deep, radiating chill that seems to rise up from the very center of the earth, a cold that bites into the joints and settles heavily in the lungs. For hundreds of years, the elite of Roman Britain had engineered their way out of this physical reality. They had conquered the damp, bone-aching cold of the island, not merely with thicker wool, but with spectacular feats of subterranean fire. But civilization is an incredibly heavy thing to maintain. It requires a relentless, invisible engine of labor to keep it moving, and when that engine finally runs out of fuel, the cold returns with a terrifying patience. At the height of the provincial administration, a grand rural estate like the one nestled in the Cotswold Valley at Chedworth was not just a home, it was an organism that breathed heat. Beneath the exquisite, multicolored mosaic floors of its dining rooms and its sprawling bath complexes lay the hypocaust, a hollow world of subterranean engineering. The floors were suspended on hundreds of small pillars made of stacked ceramic tiles. Outside the main walls, in a sunken service area called the praefurnium, enslaved workers and laborers stood in the ash and soot, feeding massive fires around the clock. The hot air and smoke from these furnaces were drawn directly under the floors and up through hidden flues built inside the walls, wrapping the rooms in a constant, radiant warmth. But this luxury was not a permanent magic trick. It was tied directly to the administrative tether of the empire. To run a hypocaust required an astonishing, unending supply of chopped wood, which required managed forests, heavy iron axes, and fleets of wooden carts. It required a steady, obedient labor force bound by a functioning economy of coin or strict civic coercion. When the system of taxation faltered, when the coins stopped arriving from the continent to pay the garrison that enforced the local laws, the complex web of labor began to unspool. The men who spent their days deep in the woods swinging axes no longer had an incentive, or perhaps the compulsion, to keep cutting. The carts stopped arriving at the villa gates. The fire in the praefurnium did not go out in a single dramatic moment of invasion. It went out because there was simply no one left to feed it, and no authority left to demand that the wood be brought. Imagine the slow, creeping sensory shift inside the villa as the system failed. Without the furnace, the vast, hollow space beneath the suspended floors became a trap for the damp. The stagnant air underneath cooled, turning the beautiful mosaic floors above into massive slabs of ice-cold stone. The walls, heavily plastered and painted with vibrant frescoes of gods and geometric gardens, were suddenly denied the dry heat of the flues. Damp plaster, cold ash, and the slow accumulation of soil. The atmosphere inside these grand rooms shifted from Mediterranean luxury to a clammy, echoing chill.
Consider the anatomy of this decay over the course of a single, brutal winter. It begins with a single, hairline fracture in the mortar of the roof, weakened by years of unchecked frost. The relentless rain exploits this tiny vulnerability, dripping slowly, steadily into the attic space. It soaks into the wooden beams, bringing the heavy, sweet rot of damp timber. The water eventually finds its way down into the plaster of the walls, plaster that was designed to be kept bone dry by the ambient heat of the flues, now acts like a sponge. The vibrant frescoes, the painted vines, the geometric borders, the faces of classical myths begin to blister and flake away, falling as colored dust to the freezing floors below. The smell of the room changes from dry, dusty stone to the sharp, earthy scent of wet chalk and mildew. Down on the exquisite floor, where the heat no longer radiates, nature begins its slow reclamation. A thin, slick layer of green algae and pale moss creeps across the delicate glass tesserae of the mosaics, tracing the lines of the sea god's beard in rhymed frost. The architecture is no longer a shield against the landscape, it is surrendering to it. In the grand bathhouse, the transition was profound. The caldarium, the hot room that once pulsed with thick, scented steam, went completely dead. The pools, lined with waterproof pink mortar, slowly drained away, or turned into stagnant, freezing puddles filled with blown leaves. The thick, greenish window glass, designed to keep the heat in and the drafts out, eventually cracked and fell from its lead settings, shattering on the tiles below. No glazier came from the local town to fix it, because the town no longer had a glassmaker. The wind found a gap in the bathhouse roof, whistling through a broken clay tile with a low, hollow hum. It became the only sound in a room that was once filled with the splash of water and the voices of administrators discussing the prices of grain. As the decades pushed deeper into the 5th and 6th centuries, the people who still inhabited the estate had to adapt to the reality of the cold. They did not abandon the site completely, but they drastically changed how they interacted with the stone giant they lived inside. Because the hypocaust no longer functioned, the grand dining rooms became inhabitable in the winter. A floor of stone, no matter how beautifully decorated with scenes of Orpheus taming the wild beasts, is a freezer if there is no fire beneath it. So the inhabitants made a deeply practical, deeply shocking adjustment. They brought the fire inside. Archaeology reveals a heartbreaking, fascinating transition. Right in the center of these exquisite, meticulously laid Roman mosaics, we find the scorched, blackened circles of open hearth fires. A family, huddling against the winter, simply piled gathered wood directly on top of the intricate faces of the classical gods and lit a fire to stay warm. The smoke, having no chimney, would have billowed up into the painted ceilings, blackening the frescoes with a thick layer of greasy soot. Over time, as the roof tiles slipped and the wind blew through the broken windows, earth and dirt began to accumulate indoors. The formal dining room had become a cave. Outside in the courtyards, the complex water systems were suffering a similar quiet death. The Romans had tamed the local springs, directing the water through lead pipes to feed the ornamental fountains and the latrines. But lead was an incredibly valuable material in a world that had stopped mining. The pipes were ripped out of the ground, melted down, and recast into simpler tools, weights, or trade goods. Without the pipes, the water simply followed gravity. It backed up in the carefully engineered drains, choked with years of unswept autumn leaves and silt. The grand manicured courtyards slowly turned into boggy, overgrown swamps. Living in the ruins of the Roman world was not like surviving a sudden apocalypse. It was an agonizingly slow, generational retreat. To the great-grandchildren of the men who had built the hypocausts, these massive stone structures must have seemed incomprehensible, bizarre, crumbling mountains of masonry that were too cold to live in and too heavy to repair. Instead of trying to maintain the stone walls, they often chose a much more sensible path. They went out into the overgrown courtyards or just outside the perimeter walls and sank heavy wooden posts into the earth. They built warm, efficient, thatched timber halls right in the shadow of the decaying masonry. They left the stone to the moss, the lichen, and the frost. They let the earth swallow the mosaics and the hypocaust pillars, letting the architecture of an empire return to the soil from which it was cut. The dread of this era was the dread of watching something immense and seemingly permanent slowly dissolve before your eyes, knowing you lack the power, the manpower, and the administrative reach to stop the decay. It was the terrifying realization that civilization is not a building you can hide inside forever. It is a daily, exhausting performance that can easily be forgotten. From today's view, it's a catastrophic loss of engineering, a heartbreaking destruction of art and comfort. From their view, it was simply the most practical way to stay warm when the world stopped sending the wood. And that's what's so chilling.
To understand the reality of this era, you must step outside the heavy timber door of the hall, walk past the low wattle fences, and stand in the absolute, uncompromising black of a moonless winter night. The true dark of the 5th and 6th centuries is not a historical metaphor for ignorance, it is a physical environment. It is a profound atmospheric weight that presses against the eyes and settles over the landscape with a terrifying totality. We are a people addicted to illumination, living in a modern world where the night sky is perpetually bruised by the orange and white glare of cities. We have forgotten how heavy the darkness can be when there is no artificial light to push it back. In the centuries of Roman administration, night had been something the empire actively fought. The major towns and military fortresses were not just centers of law, they were islands of fire. They burned through mountains of wood and rivers of imported olive oil to keep the public squares visible, to light the hypocaust furnaces, and to allow the scribes to read their ledgers long after the sun had gone down. Civilization, in the Roman mind, was the ability to conquer the dark, to impose an artificial, illuminated order upon the natural rhythm of the earth. But when the state withdrew, the great fires went out, the supply chains that moved the oil across the sea snapped, the municipal budgets that paid the night watchmen to keep the braziers burning evaporated into the silence. Without the empire, the night rushed back in to reclaim the island. It swallowed the towns, it erased the grand highways, and it drowned the valleys in a sea of shadow. But this was not the end of the world, it was simply the return of the natural order. Listen closely to the sound of this massive, quiet dark. Up on the high ridge, where the skeleton of an abandoned stone villa still clings to the chalk, the wind finds a gap in the ruined masonry. It moves slowly through a broken roof tile, creating a low, hollow whistle. It is a solitary, continuous hum, carrying down the slope and over the frost-hardened fields. It serves as a steady metronome, marking the slow passage of the deep night, a sound of the old world singing softly over the new one. Down in the valley, nestled into the curve of a freezing stream, the village sleeps. It is invisible from the ridge, betrayed only by the faint, acrid smell of wood smoke trapped low to the ground by the cold air. Inside the timber hall, the night dictates the entire shape of human existence. In the depths of a British winter, darkness can last for 14 hours or more.
This is not a duration of time that a human body can spend in a single uninterrupted state of unconscious slumber. Without the artificial light to extend the working day, the people of the long dusk experienced sleep not as a single block of time, but as a shifting, textured landscape. They practiced what we now call biphasic sleep, a natural biological rhythm that belonged entirely to the pre-industrial world.
The family would lie down on heavy wooden platforms, wrapped tightly in dense, undyed wool and thick animal furs, shortly after the sun dipped below the horizon and the last glow faded from the winter sky. The cold inside the hall would deepen, creeping inward from the wattle and daub walls, condensing on the heavy thatch of the roof. For the first few hours, the sleep was heavy, pulling them down into the quiet exhaustion of a body that had spent the day fighting the heavy clay of the fields. But then, somewhere in the dead center of the night, they would wake. This middle hour of the night, wedged between the first and second sleep, was a unique psychological space. It was a time of hushed, low-voiced conversation. A father might rise and throw another knot of dry oak onto the fire, watching the sparks swirl up into the dark rafters. A mother might nurse a waking infant in the warmth of the furs. A grandfather might softly recite a prayer or tell a fragment of a story, keeping the names of their ancestors alive in the quiet. Watch a figure sitting near the low, pulsing orange light of the fire. They are not idle, but their movements are slow, hypnotic, and entirely divorced from the frantic pace of daylight. An older man is quietly oiling a stiff leather harness, his thick, calloused hands working the rendered animal fat deep into the grain of the hide. The sound is a soft, rhythmic squeak and rub, repeating over and over in the quiet hall. The heavy smell of the tallow mixes perfectly with the wood smoke. Beside him, someone is carving a wooden spoon from a piece of seasoned ash. The sharp iron blade shears through the soft wood with a satisfying, papery hiss. Shaving after shaving falls silently into the white ashes of the hearth. These tactile, solitary tasks require very little light, guided instead by the deep muscular memory of the hands. They are acts of maintenance, small repetitive rhythms of preservation that anchor the mind while the vast freezing dark presses against the wattle and daub walls outside. Over the low hurdle at the end of the hall, the cattle shifted heavily in the straw. The warm, earthy smell of their breath mingled with the sharp tang of the ash. You could hear the slow, rhythmic sound of their breathing, the occasional clatter of a horn against a wooden post, a deeply comforting reminder that the family was not alone in the immense freezing void. This was a world where survival was a collective, shared warmth. The boundary of the known universe had shrunk, pulling back from the distant capital of Rome, pulling back from the paved highways, until it ended precisely at the edge of the firelight. The imperial water clocks had run dry. The sundials in the abandoned courtyards were choked with weeds and useless in the long winter. But the people did not need them. The paper goes first. The people stay. And the people who stay are no longer bound by the rigid, linear time of a written ledger or a taxation schedule. They are governed by the turning of the stars, the phases of the moon, and the slow, inevitable creak of the frost. During these waking hours of the deep night, the dark was not an enemy. It was a sanctuary. It was a time when the demands of the soil were temporarily suspended. There was no plowing to be done, no wood to be chopped, no frantic preparation for a coming official. There was only the fire, the breath, and the quiet. They mended fishing nets by feel. They spun wool with spindles that twirled blindly in the shadows, their fingers knowing the thickness of the yarn by touch alone.
They lived out an entire, undocumented dimension of human existence entirely in the dark, weaving a fabric of survival that required no ink to endure. After an hour or two of this quiet communion, the heavy, natural lethargy would return. The fire would be banked with ash to preserve the hot coals for the morning. The voices would drift away into silence, and the hall would sink back into the second sleep, resting deeply until the gray, hesitant light of dawn finally began to outline the gaps in the timber walls. When we think of the Dark Ages, we often imagine a time of constant terror, picturing villagers cowering in their huts, waiting for the wolves or the war bands to break down the door. And while violence certainly existed, the far more common, far more pervasive reality of the era was simply the crushing boredom and the profound quiet of a 14-hour night. The dread was not always the dread of the sword. It was the ordinary dread of a leaking roof, a dwindling woodpile, and the isolating realization that the outside world was vast, unlit, and entirely indifferent to your existence. Yet, within that isolation, there is a profound and mesmerizing peace. The absence of the empire meant the absence of its noise. Without the endless grinding of the administrative machine, the people were allowed to sink back into the rhythm of the landscape. They became a part of the ecology of the island once more, rising with the birds and sleeping with the closing of the flowers. They were surrounded by a darkness so pure, so unpolluted, that stepping outside on a clear night meant standing under a sky choked with a terrifying density of stars. The Milky Way was a brilliant, pale scar torn across the heavens, throwing enough faint silver light to cast soft shadows on the snow. To live in the long dusk was to accept the dark as a permanent, undeniable neighbor. It was to understand that human authority is fragile, but the turning of the earth is absolute. The wind continues to find the broken roof tile on the ridge, whistling its hollow tune through the ruins of a forgotten magistrate's dream. The frost continues to gather on the silent mosaic. But down in the valley, the breath of the cattle is steady, the embers are warm, the people remain. From today's view, it's a terrifying plunge into primitive darkness, the extinguishing of the magnificent light of classical civilization. From their view, it was simply the time to bank the fire, lower the voice, and wait out the long winter night. And that's what's so chilling.
When the abstract authority of an empire evaporates, power does not simply disappear, it condenses. It shrinks down from the grand, invisible network of laws and ledgers, and it takes on a physical, heavy, and intensely local form. It stops being a wax seal on a parchment delivered by a courier, and it becomes a man sitting by a fire, offering you a cup of ale and a place to sleep. In the centuries following the withdrawal of the Roman administration, the geography of power across Britain underwent a profound transformation. The grand stone basilicas in the old towns, where magistrates once debated civic taxation, were left to the damp and the ivy. High up on the chalk ridges, the wind continued to find the broken roof tiles of the abandoned villas, whistling its low, hollow metronome over a landscape that no longer cared about marble. Down in the valleys, and often inside the massive grassy earthworks of ancient pre-Roman hill forts, a new kind of architecture was rising. It was built not to last for 1,000 years, but to serve the immediate, desperate needs of the present. It was the Great Timber Hall. To step inside one of these halls in the 6th century was to step into the center of a newly constructed universe. The building itself was a massive statement of resources and labor. constructed from thick whole trunks of oak hauled from the surrounding woods. The wood was green, heavy, and smelled sharply of sap and damp earth. Inside, the space was vast and cavernous, but it was not divided into the neat, specialized geometric rooms of a Roman villa. It was a single continuous volume of space, dominated entirely by the long hearth fire trench that ran down the center of the earthen floor. The smoke from the fire rose into the high, dark rafters, curing the meats hung from the beams and seeping through the heavy thatch of the roof. There were no glass windows. The only light came from the open doors during the day and the pulsing golden glow of the hearth at night. This was a world of smoke, shadow, and murmured conversation. At the center of this world, seated on a raised wooden bench draped with thick woolen cloaks and animal furs, sat the king. We must strip the word king of its medieval fairy tale associations. This was not a monarch ruling over millions with a golden crown and a standing army. This was a warlord, a local chieftain, a man whose realm might only extend as far as he could ride a horse in a single day. His authority was derived entirely from his ability to protect the people inside the hall and his ability to feed them. The paper goes first, the people stay. And when the people stay, they require a new system to bind themselves together. In the absence of an imperial economy, the abstract concept of money was replaced by the incredibly concrete, face-to-face economy of the gift.
In the Roman world, loyalty was purchased with coins. A legionary stood his post on Hadrian's wall because he expected a regular shipment of silver denarii, which he could exchange for wine, grain, or leather at any market across the empire. But in the long dusk of the island, that frictionless currency had dried up. Instead, the small kings bound their followers to them through direct, personal generosity. The king was the ring giver. He sat at the high seat and distributed the wealth of his small kingdom directly into the hands of his retainers. The wealth of this age was not hidden away in a ledger. It was worn on the body. It was a heavy silver armband. It was a beautifully crafted cloak brooch inlaid with deep red garnets. It was a finely balanced iron sword, forged with a pattern-welded blade that shimmered like water in the firelight. When a king handed a young warrior a sword, he was not paying a salary. He was forging a deeply personal, sacred bond. The warrior accepted the weapon, and in return he swore an oath to stand between the king and the dark. He swore to fight for the man who fed him, to defend the hall, and if necessary, to die protecting the lord who had given him the gift. This was a society held together by tension, by the invisible threads of obligation, honor, and mutual survival. In the immense, terrifying quiet of a world without state protection, the timber hall was the only safe harbor. To be cast out of the hall, to become an exile, a wanderer in the dark without a lord to protect you, was a fate considered worse than death. Outside the wattle walls lay the freezing rain, the deep woods, and the absolute vulnerability of being alone. Inside lay the fire, the shared roasted meat, the passed cup of mead, and the physical presence of your kin. You belonged to the hall, and the hall belonged to you. Modern pop culture loves to paint this era as a relentless cinematic bloodbath, a grinding Game of Thrones landscape where massive armies slaughtered each other into extinction on muddy battlefields. But the reality of warfare for these small kings was far more intimate, far more constrained, and heavily limited by the agricultural calendar. You cannot wage a total war of annihilation when your warriors also need to go home to harvest the barley. Warfare in the post-Roman world was often seasonal and highly localized. It was a sudden, sharp raid into a neighboring valley to steal a herd of cattle. It was a brief, violent skirmish at a river crossing to establish a boundary. It was a performance of strength, designed to prove that the king was capable of defending his people and securing the resources needed to keep the hall fed and the gifts flowing. Large-scale massacres were rare, simply because the population was too small and the margins of survival were too thin to waste human life on apocalyptic conquest.
When a battle did happen, it was terrifying precisely because of its intimacy. It was not a clash of faceless, uniformed legions following the blast of a brass trumpet. It was a collision of neighbors. It was men fighting with heavy ash spears and wooden shields covered in leather, slipping in the wet grass, shouting the names of their fathers. When the fighting was over, the winner took the cattle, took the fallen weapons, and retreated back to the warmth of their own fire. The borders of these tiny kingdoms were not drawn on maps. They expanded and contracted like breathing lungs, defined entirely by the reach of the king's reputation. This hyper-local power made the world incredibly fragile. A Roman province could survive the death of a governor because the bureaucracy remained, but when a small king died in the 6th century, the entire structure of his world could collapse overnight. The oaths of loyalty were sworn to the man, not to the office. If his heir was weak, or if a rival chieftain smelled vulnerability, the warband might fracture. The hall might be abandoned, left to rot in the rain, its massive oak posts eventually sinking back into the soft earth, leaving nothing but dark stains in the soil for future archaeologists to puzzle over. This constant cycle of raising a hall, gathering a following, and eventually fading back into the landscape is the true rhythm of the era. It is a deeply human, deeply desperate attempt to build a shelter against the long night. The kings of this age were not monsters, nor were they legendary heroes with magical swords. They were simply men trying to hold the center together when the wider world had fallen apart. Imagine sitting in the shadows of that hall on a freezing night. The wind howls outside, rattling the heavy timber door. You are wearing a thick woolen cloak, leaning against the warm, packed earth of the fire trench. You hear the soft, rhythmic chanting of a poet in the corner, reciting the lineage of the Lord to remind everyone in the room that they belong to something older than themselves. The Roman road a few miles away is covered in frost and weeds, its stones cracked, its purpose forgotten. But here, inside the wood and the smoke, there is warmth, there is order. From today's view, it's a primitive regression, a collapse from the heights of classical law into the brutal simplicity of a warlord's tribalism. From their view, it was the only way to build a roof over your head when the sky of the old world fell in. And that's what's so chilling.
Stand on the eastern coast of the island in the gray, hesitant light of early morning. A thick, cold mist rolls off the expanse of the North Sea, tasting heavily of salt and wet kelp. The tide is out, exposing a wide, flat expanse of mud and shingle. Against this quiet shore, a wooden keel scrapes softly onto the gravel. It is a small, clinker-built boat, its overlapping oak planks held together with iron rivets, its sail dark with damp. The people stepping out of this boat are cold, exhausted, and carrying the heavy woolen smell of a long, miserable crossing. They are the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the peoples of the continent whose homelands are slowly sinking into the coastal marshes, pushing them out across the water in search of higher, drier ground. For centuries, this arrival has been painted as a cinematic apocalypse.
The history books, leaning heavily on the traumatized biblical thunder of Gildas and the sweeping generalizations of later medieval monks, taught us to envision this moment as a tidal wave of blood. We are conditioned to picture massive, organized fleets of savage warriors leaping onto the beaches, forming impenetrable shield walls, and marching westward in a unified campaign of total extermination. We imagine the native Britons being slaughtered to a man or pushed entirely off the cliffs of Wales, leaving the island completely empty and ready to be renamed England. But when we turn away from the dramatic storytelling of the later centuries and look down at the dirt, the dark reality is far quieter, far messier, and far more deeply human. The archaeology does not show us a sudden, clean line of fire and displacement. It shows us a slow, generational blurring. The people stepping off these boats were not, for the most part, professional armies. They were families. They were farmers, carrying seed grain in leather pouches. They brought their cattle, their dogs, and their children. They were not looking for an empire to conquer. They were looking for a valley that would grow barley, a patch of earth that would not flood when the winter storms blew in. When they walked inland, they did not find an empty wilderness. They found the descendants of the Roman province, the native Brittonic farmers who had already been living in the long dusk for generations. The edge of these two worlds was not a rigid, fortified border guarded by armies. It was a hazy, permeable zone of interaction that shifted slowly over hundreds of years. Imagine a river valley where these two peoples meet. On one side of the river, a native British family lives in a round house or a simple timber hall, still holding on to a faint, localized memory of Roman Christianity, speaking the rolling, lyrical vowels of the Brittonic tongue. On the other side of the river, a newly arrived Germanic family has raised a longhouse, burying their dead with cremation urns and praying to Woden and Thunner for a good harvest. At first, there is likely suspicion, tension, and the occasional sharp violence of cattle raids. But you cannot maintain a state of total, absolute war with the people who live a mile away when you both have to survive the exact same freezing winter. The heavy clay soil of the island demands the same brutal labor from anyone who tries to turn it.
Slowly, inevitably, the two worlds begin to rub against each other. It begins with the simplest necessities of survival. The British farmer has a surplus of woven wool. The Saxon farmer has a newly forged iron axe head. They meet at the shallow ford of the river. They do not share a language, but they share the universal, urgent need for winter supplies. They trade. A Germanic saucer brooch, intricate and stamped with animal motifs, finds its way onto the cloak of a British woman. A rough, hand-built clay pot made in the native style ends up holding the drinking water in a Saxon hall. Over the decades, the barrier of language begins to soften and dissolve. The newcomers look at the vast, ancient landscape of the island, a place mapped long before they arrived, and they have no words for its specific geography. So they borrow them. They point to a wide, meandering river, and the natives say its name is Tamesis. The newcomers shape their mouths around the alien word, and it becomes the Thames. They borrow the British word come for a deep valley and tor for a rocky hill. The names of the rivers, the oldest and most permanent features of the land, the Avon, the Ouse, the Severn, remain stubbornly British, woven forever into the new Germanic tongue. But the most profound proof of this quiet mingling does not lie in the words, it lies beneath the soil. Consider a cemetery dug into the soft gravel of a river terrace in the 6th century. If the story of total extermination were true, we would find only the dead of the conquerors, segregated and distinct. Instead, we find a beautiful, confounding puzzle.
Here in the earth, we find a traditional Germanic cremation. The body has been burned on a pyre, the fragments of white bone carefully collected and placed in a dark clay urn, decorated with stamped runes and geometric lines, resting exactly as it would have in the homelands of the continent. But right next to it, only a few feet away, is a traditional British inhumation, a body laid flat on its back, head pointing to the west in the Christian style, completely untouched by fire. They share the same soil. They share the same cemetery. Even more startling are the bodies that refuse to fit into a single category. Archaeologists unearth the skeleton of a woman buried with the full, unmistakable wealth of a Germanic elite. She wears heavy bronze cruciform brooches at her shoulders. She has a string of vibrant glass and amber beads across her chest, and an iron knife at her waist. By all visual markers, she is a Saxon. But when the modern science of isotopic and DNA analysis looks at her bones and her teeth, it reveals a different truth. Her ancestry is entirely native Brittonic. She grew up drinking the water of the western hills, not the water of the continent. How does a native woman end up buried as a Saxon lady? She married into the New World. Or perhaps she simply adopted the clothing, the style, and the culture of the people who held the power in her valley. Identity in the long dusk was not a matter of pure, immutable bloodlines. It was a matter of survival, of alignment, of choosing a tribe when the state had completely evaporated.
This is how a country changes. It is not always a sudden, sharp snapping of the timeline. Sometimes it is a grandfather who tells stories in the old British tongue to a grandchild who only answers in Old English. It is a slow generational forgetting, a fading of one world into another, as gentle and inevitable as the twilight deepening into night. The people who called themselves Britons slowly began to call themselves by the names of their new lords. They became the people of the Angles, the people of the Saxons. They became the English. High above this slow, messy blending of humanity, on the chalk ridge, the ruins of the Roman villa continue to crumble. The wind hums its low, steady metronome through the broken roof tile. The old empire cared deeply about sharp lines. It loved walls, borders, and crisp written definitions of who was a citizen and who was a barbarian. But the long dusk does not care about borders. The dusk is a great equalizer. It takes the Briton and the Saxon, the Christian and the pagan, places them in the same freezing valley, and forces them to figure out how to share the fire. From today's view, it's the sweeping, violent birth of the Anglo-Saxon nation, the dramatic erasure of native Britain by waves of conquering warriors. From their view, it was simply a slow, quiet mingling of neighbors, deciding whose gods to pray to when the rain wouldn't stop, and learning to speak the language of the people in the next valley. And that's what's so chilling. The first sensation is the sharp, biting scent of crushed oak galls, vinegar, and the faint coppery tang of iron. Then comes the cold. It is a deep architectural cold that seems to radiate from the thick, mortared stone walls of the small cell, a chill that settles into the knuckles and stiffens the spine. In the center of this freezing room, a single point of light pushes back against the heavy dark. It is a beeswax candle, sputtering softly, casting a small golden circle of illumination across a slanted wooden desk. Leaning into this tiny sphere of light is a figure wrapped in thick, undyed wool. You are listening to the sound of survival. It is not the clash of swords, nor the heavy footfalls of a marching legion. It is a quiet, rhythmic scratching sound. It is the stiff tip of a goose feather quill pulling a line of dark black ink across the pale, scraped surface of a stretched animal skin. When the Roman administration evaporated from the island, it took the infrastructure of mass literacy with it. The imperial world had been a world of casual, disposable writing. Centurions scribbled supply requests on thin wooden tablets. Magistrates fired off letters on imported Egyptian papyrus. Merchants kept ledgers of their grain shipments. Writing was a practical, everyday tool of logistics. But when the ships stopped coming, when the papyrus ran out, and when the logistics of the state collapsed, the written word did not entirely vanish. It retreated. It pulled back from the busy public squares and the noisy marketplaces, and it sought sanctuary in the deep, quiet valleys and the isolated coastal islands. It became the sacred, intensely physical work of the monastery. To understand how memory survives in the long dusk, we must look at what writing became. It ceased to be an administrative reflex and became an act of grueling physical endurance. The book was no longer a disposable thing. It was a monument, built with the same staggering investment of local resources that the kings were pouring into their timber halls. Before a monk or a nun could even begin to write, the materials themselves had to be forged from the landscape. The paper goes first, the people stay, and because the people stayed, they had to invent a new kind of page. They could not order parchment from a distant factory, they had to make vellum. This meant taking the skin of a calf or a sheep, soaking it in a vat of caustic lime for days to loosen the hair, and then stretching it brutally tight across a wooden frame. The skin was scraped with a curved iron knife over and over again until it was impossibly thin, smooth, and translucent. It was then rubbed with chalk and pumice stone to give it a fine tooth, a surface that would hold the liquid ink without bleeding. To produce a single complete copy of the Gospels required the skins of hundreds of animals. It required the wealth of an entire agricultural estate concentrated into a single, silent object.
The ink, too, was a product of the local earth. A scribe would walk into the oak forests to gather galls, the hard, round growths formed on the branches where a wasp had laid its eggs. These galls were crushed into a fine powder and boiled in rainwater or vinegar, releasing a dark, bitter tannin. To this, the scribe would add iron sulfate, creating a chemical reaction that turned the liquid a deep, permanent purplish black. A binder of tree sap or egg glare was stirred in to make it flow smoothly. The pen was plucked from the leading edge of a goose's wing, the quill carefully cured, its tip sliced at a precise angle with a razor-sharp blade. Only after weeks of this physical labor could the act of writing begin. Imagine sitting at that slanted desk in the dead of winter. There is no hypocaust beneath the floor to warm your feet. The stones are like ice. The small iron horn holding your ink sits on the desk, and the temperature in the room is so low that a thin layer of ice periodically forms on the surface of the black liquid. You have to pause, break the ice with the tip of your knife, and breathe on your stiff fingers to keep them moving. You dip the quill, you draw it across the vellum. You are copying a psalm, or a commentary by an old Roman bishop, or the rules of your monastic order. You form each letter with an agonizing, deliberate slowness. This is not cursive, it is a monumental script, each curve and ascender constructed with heavy, deliberate strokes. If you make a mistake, you cannot simply cross it out. Vellum is far too valuable. You must take your knife and carefully scrape the dried ink off the surface of the skin, praying you do not cut through the page before writing the correct letter over the roughened spot.
This is not a romantic, ethereal life of pure intellectual contemplation. It is an act of bodily sacrifice. We know this because the scribes occasionally left us their own hushed, exhausted voices, scribbled softly in the margins of the manuscripts when the abbot was not looking. In the margins of these glorious surviving texts, we find tiny, cramped notes written in Irish or Latin. The light is bad. My hand is weary. The ink is thin. I am freezing. Thank God it will soon be dark.
They were human beings, trapped in a cold room, holding back the silence one letter at a time. But the labor did not end when the ink finally dried on the last page. To protect this staggering investment of time and animal life, the finished vellum quires were stitched tightly together with heavy linen thread. A monk would then shape two thick, unyielding boards of quarter-sawn oak, carving them to fit the exact dimensions of the pages. The spine was heavily reinforced, and the thick wooden covers were wrapped in stretched, alum-tawed pigskin or soft calf leather. The final, deeply satisfying act of preservation was the attachment of a heavy brass or iron clasp. When the book was pressed shut, compressing the vellum to keep it from warping in the humidity, the metal clasp was drawn tight and locked into place with a firm, echoing click. In the cold silence of the scriptorium, that metallic click was the sound of memory being sealed and secured. The book was no longer just a collection of pages. It was a dense, heavy block, a physical fortress of words designed to withstand centuries of cold, neglect, and time. Their labor was not just about copying scripture. The monasteries became the solitary arcs of the island's memory. While the small kings were fighting over borders in the muddy valleys, the monks and nuns were meticulously maintaining the archive of the past. They copied the works of Virgil, of Pliny, of the ancient geographers. They preserved the Latin language itself, treating it not as a living native tongue, but as a sacred coded architecture that had to be memorized and passed down. They kept the names of the old world alive, ensuring that when the island eventually emerged from the long dusk, it would not have forgotten entirely where it came from. The rhythm of the monastery offered a different kind of order to the night. Out in the farming villages, the night was governed by the biphasic sleep, by the need to rest the body and tend the hearth. But inside the monastic enclosure, time was conquered by the bell. The monks lived by the liturgy of the hours. In the very deepest, darkest part of the night, at 2 or 3 in the morning, the heavy bronze bell would ring out across the cold air. The monks would rise from their hard beds. They would not speak. In absolute, unbroken silence, they would file into the stone church, carrying their small, flickering lamps. There, in the freezing nave, they would sing the night office, the vigils. Their voices, chanting the Latin psalms, would rise up into the wooden rafters, a unified, resonant sound pushing back against the immense, indifferent silence of the universe. Somewhere far beyond the monastery walls, the wind continues to find the broken clay tile of an abandoned Roman villa on a chalk ridge, whistling its low, hollow metronome into the dark. It is the sound of an empire that forgot how to hold on. But here, inside the stone cell and the echoing church, a different sound has taken root. It is the scratch of the quill. It is the turning of the vellum page. It is the chanted name.
These thin, bright lines of literacy were fragile. A single Viking raid in the later centuries, a single fire in the scriptorium, could erase decades of labor in a matter of hours, sending the books up in thick black smoke. The people who made these books knew this.
They knew that their lamps were small and the dark was incredibly vast, yet they continued to write. They continued to scrape the skins, to boil the oak galls, and to sharpen the feathers. They built a bridge of ink across the centuries, working with a quiet, stubborn defiance that is almost impossible to comprehend in our modern world of instant, infinite data. We look at an illuminated manuscript today, sitting safely behind temperature-controlled glass in a museum. We marvel at the intricate, interlaced knots of the decorated initials, the vibrant blues of crushed lapis lazuli, and the shimmering gold leaf. We see a masterpiece of early medieval art, a triumph of faith and aesthetics. From today's view, it's the heroic preservation of Western civilization, a magnificent fortress of learning standing tall against the chaos of a brutal age. From their view, it was the cramped, freezing, agonizing labor of scratching a single line of Latin onto a piece of dead calfskin before the ink turned to ice in the horn. And that's what's so chilling.
When we look back at the collapse of a vast and complex civilization, the eye is naturally drawn to the massive, sweeping tragedies of the era. We mourn the cracking of the monumental stone bridges, the silencing of the great paved highways, and the slow, inevitable rotting of the imperial archives. It is incredibly easy to let the sheer scale of the ruin obscure the tiny, persistent fires of humanity that continued to burn beneath it. But a society does not endure a long dusk merely by lamenting the loss of the light. It survives through the quiet, unrecorded architecture of daily compassion. In the absence of a state, the responsibility for human survival devolves to the individual. The vast, anonymous safety net of the empire is replaced by the incredibly heavy, immediate burden of the neighbor. Within this silent landscape, there are three small mercies that define the true character of the age. They are not grand historical events that shift the borders of kingdoms, nor are they the miraculous interventions of saints. They are entirely ordinary. But in a world without a safety net, the ordinary act of kindness is the only thing standing between a human being and the absolute dark. The first mercy occurs in the dead of winter, on the ragged edge of a forgotten Roman highway. The temperature has plummeted, and the wind carries the sharp, biting promise of sleet. A solitary traveler is moving along the frost-heaved stones, his head bowed against the gale. In the days of the empire, he could have timed his journey to reach an official mansio, expecting a lit courtyard, a warm bed, and the security of the provincial watch. Now, to be caught outside when the sun drops below the horizon is to face the terrifying, indifferent lethality of the landscape. The darkness here is not a metaphor, it is a physical weight, freezing the moisture in his breath, seeping through his heavy woolen cloak, and slowing the blood in his extremities. Through the driving sleet, he sees a faint, dull amber glow. It is a timber hall, set back from the road behind a low wattle fence. He approaches the heavy oak door. This is the moment of greatest tension in the post-Roman world. The people inside do not know him. There are no written laws to compel them to open the door, no local magistrate to punish them if they let him freeze to death on their threshold. In an age of small kings and localized loyalties, a stranger in the night is an inherent threat. He knocks, the sound muffled by the wind. Inside, the heavy murmur of voices instantly ceases. A heavy silence falls over the hall. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happens. The traveler braces himself against the freezing wood. Then the heavy iron bolt is slowly drawn back. The door swings open, releasing a sudden magnificent blast of heat, wood smoke, and the rich smell of roasted meat.
The man standing in the doorway holds a spear, his face half in shadow, assessing the shivering figure outside.
He steps aside. The stranger is ushered in. He is not asked for a coin, because coins have lost their meaning. He is led past the low hurdles to the central hearth, where the heat of the fire trench radiates into his frozen bones. A wooden bowl, worn smooth by years of use, is pressed into his trembling hands. It is filled with hot, salted barley broth and a piece of fatty mutton. He is given a dry patch of straw near the embers and a heavy fur to pull over his shoulders. This is the sacred unwritten law of hospitality, the profound physical mercy of a shared fire when the night outside is deadly. The people of the hall have surrendered a portion of their own safety, a portion of their own winter stores, simply because they recognize the fragility of a human life in the dark. The second mercy happens in a different valley, in the fading, bruised plum light of an autumn evening. The harvest has been brought in, and the fields are bare, exposing the heavy, wet clay of the soil. A father walks along the edge of a plowed furrow, holding the small, warm hand of his young daughter. They are stepping carefully over the rough ground, moving away from the smoke of their settlement and out toward the distant tree line. In the old world, the boundaries of this farm would have been meticulously recorded in a provincial land registry in a distant city. A surveyor with brass instruments would have mapped the corners, and a clerk would have copied the coordinates into a ledger. If a dispute arose, the parchment would have settled it. But the paper goes first. The people stay. And because the people stay, they must find a new way to make the boundaries permanent. Without the archive, memory is the only deed they possess. The father stops at a massive lichen-covered boulder half buried in the earth. He kneels down in the damp grass and places the child's small, warm hand flat against the rough, freezing surface of the stone. He tells her the name of the rock. He tells her the story of how his own grandfather hauled it from the riverbed with a team of oxen. They walk further, stopping at an ancient lightning-scarred oak tree that marks the turn of the property line. He points to the twisted branches and speaks the name of the neighbors whose land begins where their land ends. He makes the child repeat the names. Over and over, her small voice rings out in the quiet dusk, reciting the geography of their survival. He is not teaching her a simple list. He is transferring the entire legal and historical architecture of their world from his mind into hers. He is ensuring that when he is laid into the earth, the knowledge of who they are and what belongs to them does not vanish. It is an act of profound, forward-looking love. He is planting a memory in the dark, trusting that this child will carry the map of their lives forward, passing it down through breath and repetition. In this long dusk of the island, you belong to the quiet fields and the thinner road, and the only way to keep them is to never stop speaking their names.
The third mercy occurs at the agonizing tail end of winter, in the brutal weeks of late February or early March that the farmers call the hungry gap. This is the time when the deep cold has lingered too long, but the earth has not yet softened enough to offer new life. The root cellars are nearly empty, the wrinkled apples have long since been eaten, the salted pork is gone, and the daily ration of grain has been reduced to a thin, watery gruel. Survival is a mathematical equation balanced precariously on the edge of a knife. In a small, drafty timber house, a family stares at the bottom of their clay storage jars. They have exhausted their supplies. They have nothing left to put in the pot. In the morning, the mother walks across the frost-hardened mud of the village to stand at the threshold of a neighbor's door. She does not need to explain her presence.
The hollow exhaustion in her eyes speaks the universal language of the hungry gap. The neighbor invites her in. This family is also suffering. Their own stores are dangerously low, carefully calculated to last just until the first greens of spring push through the soil. The only grain they have left in abundance is the seed grain, the precious, untouchable reserve that must be kept safe to plant the next harvest. To eat the seed grain is to devour the future. To give it away is to risk the survival of your own children next winter. Yet the neighbor walks to the back of the hall. They untie the heavy leather cord of the seed sack. They take a wooden scoop, worn smooth by the thumb, and they dip it into the dry, golden barley. They do not give a grand speech. They do not offer a moral lecture. They simply pour 2 full scoops of grain into the mother's empty pouch. The sound of the dry barley hitting the leather is the loudest sound in the room. It is the sound of a terrifying, beautiful sacrifice. It is the quiet, heavy choice to slightly diminish one's own chances of survival to ensure that the people in the next house do not starve before the spring. These 3 small mercies, the warmth offered to the stranger, the memory entrusted to the child, the grain poured into the neighbor's pouch, do not cancel out the reality of the long dusk. They do not rebuild the hypocausts, they do not bring the couriers back to the Roman roads, and they do not stop the slow crumbling of the stone villas on the ridges. The darkness remains vast, and the silence of the era remains absolute. But they prove what the grand, sweeping narratives of collapse so often forget. They prove that humanity does not evaporate when the state machinery breaks down. The absence of an empire is not the absence of grace. Out in the freezing, unrecorded night, beyond the reach of any imperial ledger or taxation schedule, the pulse of the island remains steady. Listen closely to the quiet of the village as the winter night deepens. From the far edge of the settlement, beyond the wattle fences, comes the slow, muffled clatter of a low cattle bell at the edge of the dark. It is a warm, rhythmic sound, marking the presence of life huddled together against the cold. The fire in the hall still burns. The child still remembers the name of the stone. The neighbor still shares the grain. The systems of the old world have faded into ghosts, but the people who walk among the ruins have built something far more resilient. They have built a shelter out of one another. We have walked a long way through this quiet, undocumented landscape. We have stood on the cracked paving stones of the Roman highways, feeling the immense, crushing silence left behind when the imperial couriers stopped arriving. We have listened to the furious, heartbroken thunder of Gildas weeping in his stone cell, and we have crouched beside the dying embers in the center of the grand mosaics, watching the old world dissolve into ash and soil. We have seen the small kings handing out silver and iron in the smoky warmth of their timber halls, and we have watched the slow generational blending of native Britons and incoming Saxons at the muddy edge of a river. We have followed the thin, bright line of the monastic lamps, and we have witnessed the profound, ordinary mercies of shared fire, shared memory, and shared grain. Through all of this, a single, undeniable truth has slowly emerged from the frost-hardened earth. The paper goes first, the people stay. If this is true, if the harvest never actually stopped, if the children were still taught the boundaries of their fields, if the island was never truly abandoned, then how did this era become branded as a void? How did a landscape so intensely, stubbornly alive become known to history as the Dark Ages?
The answer lies in the deeply flawed way that later generations chose to look backward. The people who lived through the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries did not call their own time dark. They did not wake up on a freezing morning, look out at the mist rolling off their fields, and think of themselves as living in a shadow. They thought of themselves as living in the present. They were entirely occupied with the immediate, overwhelming demands of the physical world. The darkness, they knew, was simply the environmental reality of a moonless night, a time to sleep or to speak softly by the fire. The concept of the Dark Ages was not a description born of their reality. It was an invention born of our arrogance. It accreted slowly, centuries later, gathering weight like dust on a bookshelf. It began with the scholars of the Italian Renaissance, men like Petrarch, who sat in the sunlit piazzas of a recovering Europe and became obsessed with the classical glory of Rome. They loved the marble, the complex taxation, the crisp Latin poetry, and the monumental architecture of the empire. When they looked at the centuries that followed Rome's collapse, they did not see a resourceful people adapting to a localized world. They saw only the absence of the things they themselves valued. They labeled everything between the fall of Rome and their own era as tenebrae, the shadows, the dark. This habit of mind hardened in the centuries that followed. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, enamored with rationalism, bureaucracy, and the administrative state, looked at the post-Roman world and recoiled in horror. To an 18th century historian, a society without a central bank, a standing army, and a towering archive of written laws was not a society at all. It was a savage wilderness. The Victorian school books solidified the myth, drawing maps of Europe that painted the early medieval period in heavy, dramatic strokes of black ink. They taught generations of children that civilization is a linear progression, a steady march upward, and that the collapse of a sprawling, bureaucratic state was proof of moral and intellectual failure.
They looked at the empty ledgers and assumed the fields were barren. They looked at the ruins of the bathhouses and assumed the people had forgotten how to wash. They mistook the silence of the archive for the silence of the grave. The dark was never a problem of existence. It was entirely a problem of surviving trace. It was an optical illusion created by a change in the materials of survival. When a culture shifts from building in stone to building in wood, from mass-producing pottery to hand-shaping clay, from paying taxes in stamped silver to trading wool for iron, it becomes invisible to a certain kind of historian. But history is not entirely blind. If Gildas was the angry, weeping voice of the immediate ruin, the reverse mirror to his despair can be found centuries later in the calm, meticulous mind of another monk. To understand how the island finally began to emerge from the long dusk and re-enter the written memory of the world, we must look to the 8th century, to a monastery at Wearmouth, Jarrow, in the north of England, and to a man named Bede. Bede sits in a world that is beginning to rebuild its institutional memory. Unlike Gildas, who wrote in a freezing cell, surrounded by the terrifying collapse of his present, Bede writes from a place of extraordinary stability. His monastery boasts a massive library, glass in its windows, and a steady supply of fine vellum. He is looking backward across the expanse of the centuries we have just walked, and he is trying to impose order on the twilight. When Bede writes his masterpiece, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, he is essentially inventing a dawn. He takes the fractured, messy reality of the small kings, the localized skirmishes, and the slow blending of peoples, and he organizes it into a grand, sweeping narrative. He uses dates.
He calculates the years since the birth of Christ to anchor his timeline. He carefully curates the stories of kings and bishops, of miraculous conversions and grand synods, weaving them together into a unified story of how the English nation came to be. Bede's manuscript is beautiful, rational, and profoundly important. He gives the island a memory that can be copied, bound in leather, and shipped across the sea to the libraries of Europe. He turns the lights of history back on. But we must remember that Bede, for all his brilliance, is still relying on the fragments of a broken world. He is organizing a memory that was already heavily filtered by time and institutional bias. Like Gildas, Bede is a man of the church, obsessed with the elite, the kings who commanded the war bands and the bishops who built the altars. When he looks back into the dark, he is looking for the people that mattered to his specific narrative of salvation and state building. He does not write about the father teaching his daughter the name of the boundary stone. He does not write about the neighbor sharing the seed grain in the hungry gap. The ordinary, breathing reality of the village night, the slow, rhythmic sound of the cattle bell, the quiet bartering of wool for iron at the river crossing, these things remain entirely invisible in his magnificent history. The written word, even when it returns in the glorious, steady hand of Bede, still carries a profound blind spot. It remembers the crown, but it forgets the plow.
This is where our modern age offers its own unique contribution to the long dusk. For centuries, we relied entirely on men like Gildas and Bede to tell us what happened. But now, we have a different kind of mercy. We have the meticulous, slow, and profoundly democratic mercy of archaeology. The archaeologist in the trench, kneeling in the wet clay with a hand trowel and a soft brush, is performing an act of historical redemption. When they scrape away the soil to reveal the dark circular stain of a decayed timber post, they are mapping the shape of a home that no text ever recorded. When they pass the mud through a fine sieve and extract the microscopic pollen of winter wheat, they are proving that the harvest endured. When they unearth a rough, unstamped clay cooking pot or a simple iron knife buried beside a nameless farmer, they are restoring the dignity of the unwritten life. Archaeology is our modern mercy because it dismantles the myth of the empty island. It proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the absence of ink does not mean that ordinary souls stopped mattering. It forces us to confront the reverse thesis of the Dark Ages. The era was not defined by the failure of humanity, but by the astonishing resilience of the local community when the vast, invisible support systems of the state fell away. The people of the long dusk were not waiting in terror for Rome to return, nor were they waiting for the Renaissance to save them. They were simply living. They were adapting to a world that had shrunk to the horizon, finding warmth, meaning, and survival entirely on their own terms. As we pull back from the timeline, the true nature of the long dusk settles around us. It is not an abyss. It is a quiet, continuous landscape of deep woods, cold ruins, and warm hearths. It is a world where the monumental scale of the empire was replaced by the intimate scale of the neighbor. You do not need to fear the silence of this era. It is not an empty void. It is simply a place where the volume has been turned down. In this long dusk of the island, you belong to the quiet fields and the thinner road. You belong to the slow, ancient rhythm of the earth, a rhythm that requires no ledgers to validate its turning. Let the grand, sweeping judgments of the later historians fade away. Let the noise of the modern world, with its relentless, blinding illumination and its endless demands for data, dissolve completely into the shadows.
we are left only with the truth of the soil, the memory of the stone, and the low, hollow whistle of the wind finding a broken roof tile on a forgotten ridge. It is a world that survived the end of its own universe, not with a roar, but with a whisper. From today's view, it's a terrifying blackout, an era where the glorious light of antiquity was snuffed out by an illiterate and savage dark. From their view, it was simply the reality of carrying the fire forward, one freezing night at a time, long after the empire had forgotten their names. And that's what's so chilling.
The centuries do not snap shut like a book. They dissolve, slowly layering one on top of the other, until the quiet timber halls and the crumbling stone villas are pressed deep beneath the surface of the modern world. If you were to stand on that same chalk ridge today in the year 2026, the wind still moves over the landscape. It still carries the damp, heavy chill of the North Sea across the sloping valleys. But the broken clay tile is gone, swallowed by 1,000 seasons of soil, moss, and grass. The magnificent Roman road is still there, but it is buried entirely beneath thick, seamless ribbons of black asphalt, carrying the low, endless hum of heavy freight trucks instead of the rhythmic, solitary thud of an imperial courier's horse. The physical reality of the long dusk has been safely paved over, mapped by satellites, and securely locked away in the memory of the earth. To find the night, you must go indoors. You must walk away from the wet fields and step into the heart of London, into the massive red brick fortress of the British Library. Deep inside this building, far away from the noise of the traffic and the blinding glare of the modern street lamps, there is a room dedicated entirely to the preservation of silence. This is the archive. It is a highly engineered environment, a modern technological reversal of the cold ruin we have been walking through. Here, the temperature is never allowed to fluctuate with the seasons. It is held perpetually at a cool, dry, mathematically perfect stability. The air is filtered to remove the microscopic, abrasive dust of the city. The lighting is incredibly dim, casting a soft, even glow from specialized fixtures that contain no harmful ultraviolet rays. It is a sanctuary built specifically to protect the things that almost did not survive the night. Resting beneath a thick sheet of protective glass, illuminated by a single carefully calibrated lamp, is a book. It is a manuscript from the early medieval tradition, an early copy of Bede's history, held safely in the National Collection. It is a fragile, heavy thing. If you could bypass the alarms, reach through the glass, and touch it, you would not feel the smooth, frictionless, disposable surface of modern machine-milled paper. You would feel the stiff, uneven, organic texture of scraped calfskin. If you look closely, leaning in until your breath fogs the glass, you can still see the tiny, irregular hair follicle patterns of the animal that gave its life to make the page. You can see where the vellum is dangerously thin and nearly translucent, and where the freezing scribe had to press down hard with an iron knife to scrape away a mistaken letter. The ink on this page is dark brown, fading at the edges, made from the crushed oak galls and the bitter tannins of the ancient woods. It has bitten deeply into the skin, becoming one with the surface. This single thin page is the tether that connects our brightly lit, hyper-recorded modern world back to the monks shivering in their stone cells. It is the miraculous surviving fragment that gives a shape and a name to the long dusk. But as you stand in the hushed, climate-controlled quiet of the library, looking down at the meticulous Latin words,
you understand the illusion. The manuscript is beautiful, but it cannot hold the massive, undocumented weight of the era it describes. It does not record the heavy, comforting breath of the cattle tethered inside the timber hall. It does not record the warm barley poured silently into a neighbor's pouch during the hungry gap. It does not capture the slow, rhythmic sweep of the farmer's plow turning the heavy clay. The old road sleeps beneath the modern highway. The timber halls have long since dissolved entirely back into the soil, leaving only invisible stains in the earth. The paper goes first, the people stay. And even when the paper finally returns to document the survival of the island, it can only ever tell a fraction of the story. In this long dusk of the island, you belong to the quiet fields and the thinner road. The people who walked those fields did not need a book to prove they existed. They simply lived, enduring the long winter nights with a quiet, stubborn grace, trusting the earth to hold their memory. And now it is time for you to do the same. Wherever you are resting right now, let the walls of your own room soften and dissolve into the dark. Listen to the steady, even rhythm of your own breathing, rising and falling in the quiet. You are safe. The long dusk has passed. There are no ledgers to balance tonight, no couriers you need to wait for, and no fires you need to tend against the freezing wind. You can let the heavy, complicated machinery of the waking world slip completely away. You can simply exist in the quiet, drifting down into a deep, uninterrupted rest, knowing that the morning will come exactly when it is supposed to. From today's view, it's a fragile scrap of scraped calfskin behind glass, a tiny miracle of preservation that barely outlines the collapse of a classical world. From their view, it was a desperate, freezing attempt to write down the names of the living before the last lamp went out in the dark. And that's what's so chilling.